Hello, we're ready to end the Cold War. All right, so I'm gonna go over here for a second and draw a graph. This is gonna be the economy. As the economy of the United States during the Cold War, the economy of the United States was going up, 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 up. I mean, we did say that it kind of wavered a little. Maybe I should go back and say instead it went kind of like this, but it was still going up. Because, you know, it had its booms and recessions and booms and recessions, but it's still kind of going up. Well, the Soviets weren't so lucky. They did all right for a little bit, and then they stagnated. Stagnate means to kind of go flat and not change. So by the time Ronald Reagan was the president in the States in the 1980s, and he wanted to make whole new missile programs, the Soviet Union just knew they couldn't compete. It must have been a frightening time for them. The government of the Soviet Union would have seen themselves losing power. But that's not to say that everything in the Soviet Union was bad at this time, because it wasn't. During the Cold War, let me go back to my whiteboard. All right. The first man in space ever, the first man that ever went to space and came back down still alive, was Soviet. And the first satellite ever put in space was Soviet. So they did some really good things during this time, but they did some other not so good things while they were doing really well with their space exploration and technology. Their overall economy was not so good, and the overall happiness of the general average member of the public, not so good. They had this huge bureaucracy to decide which factories make what. Once again, remember that under a command economy, the business owner has very few decision-making abilities over his business. The factory manager has very little say over what the factory does. The factory manager just makes sure the employees are doing what the employees are supposed to do. They take orders from the government. Some random government employee tells the factory what they make and how many they make. And that random government employee was completely out of touch of what the everyday person needed. So they were making entirely too much of one thing and not enough at all of other things. And the things that they were making way too many of were usually really low quality. Like you could get, there were really, really low quality, terrible television sets everywhere in the Soviet Union. But things like clothing were very difficult to find. Think about how quickly, yeah, well, you're probably still growing. Think about how quickly you grow. Now, don't think about when you just want some new clothes. I'm not talking about when you just want something new. Think about when you literally don't fit in your clothes anymore. And your parents have to buy you new clothes because you don't have anything that fits anymore. Well, what if there's just not anything available in the stores? So things like that were happening. You would go to the grocery store to buy something. And let's say there's an entire row in the supermarket of canned peas, but there's nothing else. That's because some government employee told the factories that they had to can peas, but they didn't think about carrots or bread or milk or eggs. And all of those decisions were made by some government employee sitting at a desk that really knew nothing about running a grocery store, that knew nothing about what the everyday person wanted. And so it caused for a whole bunch of problems in Soviet society. All right, now that's just kind of like what was going on in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, especially towards the end of the Cold War. Now, I'm going to talk about war, a Soviet war. They had their own kind of Vietnam in Afghanistan. The Soviets, had their own Vietnam in Afghanistan. And why I'm putting that in quotes is because clearly we're talking about Afghanistan and not Vietnam, but a lot of the same problems that the United States faced in Vietnam, the Soviet Union faced in Afghanistan. So in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and they put a puppet government in charge. So they didn't put Soviets like from Russia in the government. They put Afghanis in the government, but Afghanis that were completely loyal to the Soviet Union and would do anything the Soviet Union said. So they were puppets. They were a puppet government. They tried to modernize the nation. They tried to put in all kinds of social reforms. They tried land redistribution. You know, this is mostly taking land away from the rich and giving it to the poor. Social reforms like giving women rights, because the Soviets were really big on that men and women are equal, right? You all remember that? Well, this didn't go over very well in Afghanistan, because I don't know how much you know about Afghanistan. I don't know if you know anything about Afghanistan, but Afghanistan is one of the most conservative nations on earth. Afghanistan is full of many, many, many extremely conservative Muslims. And so when the Soviets came in and tried to put these social reforms in place, these extremely conservative Muslims rose up against them and said, no way, we are not changing. And they thought that the Soviet reforms were anti-Muslim. Now, you have to understand, hopefully you already know this, but in any religion, you've got all the way from the extremely conservative ones to the pretty liberal ones. There are some pretty liberal Muslims. Some of my friends are like hip, cool Muslims. And then you've got your extremely conservative Muslims, the ones that think that women have to completely cover up, and like from here to here, they have to cover their faces. They are not allowed to show their hair at all. The extremely conservative Muslims, women are not ever allowed to leave their home. They're not allowed to be seen outside of the house. There are all kinds of other rules that these extremely conservative Muslims believe, but that's one of the big ones that most people know of. And these Muslims in the rural parts of Afghanistan were these just extremely conservative type of Muslims. And they were mad that these Soviets were coming into their country and trying to change the way that they had been running their societies. So these Muslim warriors rose up, and they were called the Mujahideen. They were Muslim religious warriors. Warriors, Mujahideen. And they went to war against the Soviets. Now, these Mujahideen, they were not a national army. They weren't the army. They were not the army of Afghanistan. These were individual guerrilla, always spell that wrong, guerrilla fighters. And they were extreme conservative religious Muslims that were fighting what they called a holy war against the Soviets. And they called themselves the Mujahideen. Now, because the Mujahideen were fighting against the communists, what do you think the United States did? Think about it for just a second. What do you think the United States did when the Mujahideen rose up against the communists? Hopefully, you said the US supported the Mujahideen. If that's what you said inside your mind, you are correct. The United States sent funds and modern weapons, and they had to smuggle it in. The United States smuggled in money and modern weapons to these extreme conservative Muslim groups that were fighting against the communists. And like the Vietnamese, hopefully you remember when this was Vietnam and the US was down here and the communists were up here, one of the main reasons that the US eventually pulled out was because no matter what they did, no matter what the US did, the Northern Vietnamese just kept sending soldiers. They just kept sending them and kept sending them and kept sending them. Well, the same thing happens to the Soviets in Afghanistan. No matter what the Soviets did, the Mujahideen kept sending these guerrilla fighters to attack the Soviets. And they had a whole bunch of help by the United States. When the United States is sending you money and sending you weapons, they can just keep fighting against the communists. So eventually, Soviet morale became really, really low. There was the military lost all interest in fighting. Soviets back home lost all interest in the war. Nobody was interested in this thing anymore. And in 1985, there was a new Soviet leader named Mikhail Gorbachev. Well, Mikhail Gorbachev wanted reform. He signed arms control treaties, signed arms controls treaties with the US, and he removed all troops from Afghanistan. So now in Afghanistan, you've got this extremely powerful group of extremist Islamic people that consider themselves holy warriors, funded and armed by the United States all over Afghanistan, and the Soviets have pulled out. Gorbachev also did this program called GLaNOST. And GLaNOST in English means openness. I might be mispronouncing that, sorry. It's supposed to be a Russian word and it means openness. And his thing, why can't I spell? He ended censorship. What? In the Soviet Union, he ended censorship. Not only did he end censorship, he encouraged the people to openly talk about the problems of the Soviet Union, like the government of the Soviet Union. He encouraged people to openly talk about these things because, I'm sure he understood that if you can't admit you have a problem, it'll never be fixed. You have to be able to talk about problems. Like, oh my goodness, I talk about the problems of my country all the time. I'm always complaining about what I hate about the United States. But it's not that I hate the United States. It's I hate these little things and I want them to change. I talk about what I hate so that I can encourage other people to talk about those same things and we can change those things. So Gorbachev, like encouraged people in the Soviet Union to openly talk about problems with the Soviet Union. He also did a program called Perestroika. Perestroika completely restructured the government. He restructured the government. He made for less bureaucracy. He let factory managers make decisions about the factory. And he let farmers sell their products on a free market. These are major, major changes from how the Soviet Union has been run for a long time now. But, and it all sounds great to you and I. These sound like wonderful things, but he may possibly have made really big changes too quickly. He just did it all at once. And when he did it all at once, it led to major economic turmoil. There were these factories that had been running forever, and the only thing that was keeping them open was that the government was paying for them to be kept open. Like, let's talk about the factory that made television sets. Well, I already told you that there were far too many TVs. There were more TVs than anyone in the Soviet Union could ever buy. And that was because some government official sitting at some desk had told the factory to keep making those TVs. Well, now the TV factory, that all they know how to do is make TVs, they're starting to go out of business because nobody's buying their TVs. In the past, the government was keeping them open. But now, with a freer market, they can't stay open. And when they can't stay open, what happens to their employees? You got it. The employees get fired. So we've got crazy high unemployment, which leads to social unrest. High amounts of unemployment always leads to social unrest. No matter where you are in the world, if you've got a whole bunch of people that don't have jobs, you're going to have a whole bunch of people not happy. And there were different people that had ideas of fixing it. Some people wanted to go back to the old way, because even if they worked in some TV factory that was making TVs that nobody was buying, they still had a job and a paycheck. It didn't really matter to them if the Soviet Union needed those television sets. They had a job, and that's all they cared about. And then there were other people that wanted even more radical changes. So the society was kind of split between the people that had a regular, steady job, no matter what. The government was just paying their paycheck. And so they wanted to go back to how it was. And then you had other people that were saying, this clearly isn't working. We have to do more changes, bigger changes, radical changes to help society. When Gorbachev started kind of letting up a little bit, there were all kinds of Soviet countries that started pulling away and demanding their own independence. In 1991, the Baltics, Latvia, no, you know what? Think for a second. Where are the Baltics? Because I need you to know this. I need you to know where the Baltics are and where the Balkans are. Think. Okay, now I'm going to open up a map. These countries here, these are the Baltics. They had been part of the Soviet Union, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. These are the Baltics. In 1991, all three of these countries won their independence. So I'm just going to say Baltics. They won their independence. There was an attempted coup against Gorbachev. This was by old school people, the people that wanted to go back to the old ways. There was an attempted coup against him, but it failed. Yet, because there actually was an attempted coup that made it pretty far, Gorbachev himself appeared weak. And when he appeared weak, other nations or other parts of the Soviet Union started rising up and demanding their independence. And later in 1991, the entire Soviet Union collapsed because everyone was demanding their independence. Gorbachev looked weak. Everybody was fighting for their independence. And then we got 12 independent nations, plus the 3 Baltics that had already gotten their independence. And so this is 15 total. Out of these 15, the 2 largest independent nations were Kazakhstan and Ukraine. When these countries got their independence, the world map had to be completely redrawn. And this happened in my lifetime. I mean, in 1991, I was 12 years old. I was in the 7th grade in 1991. So from the time I was, when do you start looking at maps in school? I don't know, maybe 1st grade, 2nd grade. From the time I was 6 or 7 in school until the time I was 12 in school, the world map looked the same and of the European era. And then suddenly when I was 13, the map was different. So after a whole 69 years, the Soviet Union was no more. Many people today blame Gorbachev for the failure. They believe that when he allowed just a little freedom, people started wanting more and more and more and more. If you rule with a strong fist and everyone has to do exactly what you say all the time, no matter what, then people just follow orders. But if you give people a little freedom, they want a little more freedom, and then they want a little more, and then they want a little more. And so people that like the fact that the Soviet Union broke up praise Gorbachev for ending the Soviet Union. But people that liked it how it was blame him and say it's all his fault. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, it left one superpower in the world. Who is that? That's the United States. Still today, 2021, right now, February, what is it, 21st, 22nd, there is one global superpower, and that is the United States of America. And some people love that. Some people see the United States as the great protector and bringer of freedom. But other people fear the enormous amount of power the US has. So it just depends. And then there are some people that are kind of in the middle. Some people are like, yeah, the US is pretty cool, but the US is also pretty scary because they're so big and so powerful. And there are some people that there's some people that think it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And there are some people that purely just fear and hate the United States. And there are other people that have no fear and no hatred for the United States and only worship the United States. But when the whole lesson is, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it left one global, one world superpower, and that is the United States of America. We're all done. That was a pretty short lecture.